To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
She was just 19 years old, a newlywed, a devout Christian. And on a cool October night in 1974, she walked into Stanford University's Memorial Church and never came out. When her body was discovered hours later, what police found shocked even the most seasoned investigators. She'd been murdered inside of a sacred place, brutally assaulted with an ice pick, and posed in a disturbingly ritualistic way. Her body surrounded by religious objects. Rumors of satanic sacrifice began to swirl, feeding into the moral panic of the time. Despite fingerprint evidence and a semen sample collected at the scene, the case would go unsolved for more than 4 decades. Then in 2018, a stunning breakthrough finally revealed the truth, one that had been hiding in plain sight all along. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 292, the story of Arlis Perry, the Stanford church member. A case where forensic science, decades later, was the only thing capable of cutting through rumor, myth, and silence. Arlis Perry was just beginning her life. Born in Linton, North Dakota in February 1995, she was the youngest child of parents Marvin and Jean. The family was incredibly religious. They were devout Christians who grew up inside of the 4 walls of the local Presbyterian church. In 1986, Arlis's family moved to Bismarck, which was a small, quiet, isolated city on the eastern banks of the Missouri River. Her parents ran an automotive company and helped create the Bismarck Reformed Church, which would later be named the Bismarck Community Church. Her father, Marvin, served as an elder and the Sunday school superintendent there for years. Friends described Arlis as kind, warm, and deeply devoted to her values. She was the kind of person who didn't just talk about her beliefs, she lived them. On weekends, she taught Sunday school and worked for Youth Life, a Christian youth organization dedicated to spreading the word of Jesus Christ to adolescents and teenagers, helping them develop their faith. While at Bismarck High School, Arlis met the man that she would eventually marry, Bruce Perry. He was her high school sweetheart. By all accounts, they were your all-American couple. Arlis was a conservative religious cheerleader, and Bruce Perry was an athlete who set many of the local records for track and field. They were both smart, kind, and just had everything going for them. In 1973, they graduated from high school. Bruce moved thousands of miles away to California, where he'd been accepted into Stanford's pre-med program. And Arlis stayed behind, where she took classes at the community college. This was the first time that they had ever been apart, so the long distance was tough on them. But for the next 12 months, they made it work. They stuck together. Then after about a year of long-distance dating, Bruce returned back to Bismarck and asked Arlis to marry him. She, of course, said yes. He was her high school sweetheart. So after that, Arlis packed her bags and moved to California to be with him while he continued working toward his degree in human biology. This was the first time she had ever left. Up until this point, she had lived a pretty sheltered life. The wedding occurred on August 17th, 1974, at none other than the Bismarck Reformed Church. They stayed in North Dakota for about 2 weeks after the wedding, but then they officially relocated together to California. And during that time, Bruce spent most of his free time studying. If he wasn't in class, he had his nose in the books trying to keep his grades up. He also had to work to financially support him and Arlis. On the other hand, she assumed more of the traditional housewife role. She stayed home, cooked, cleaned, did everything that needed to be done around the house. It was all a big change from the quiet small town life that she was used to living. But despite the culture shock, she tried to settle into a new routine. She also spent a lot of time at the Stanford Memorial Church, the place where she'd eventually be killed. By all accounts, the couple was navigating the usual early bumps of marriage. They were young. Arlis was away from her family for the first time in her entire life, and they were just a few months into their new life together. Her friends would later say that Arlis was lonely. She would regularly send letters back home to friends and family saying how alone she felt. It was really hard for her to make new friends in California, and Bruce was gone a lot of the time. He was either at work or he was at school. But some of that loneliness seemed to go away after she got a part-time job as a receptionist at a law firm. She didn't get the job because she necessarily needed the money, but the job gave her purpose. She got out of the house and she got to meet new people. And according to friends and family, she loved it. On the evening of October 12, 1974, Arlis told Bruce she wanted to walk down to the mailbox to send off some letters to go back home. But he didn't want her walking alone. It wasn't like it was dangerous, but he wanted to spend some more time with her because he'd been gone a lot. So at around 11:30 p.m., they began walking toward the mailbox. But on their walk, they got into a little bit of an argument. You couldn't really say that it was a fight. It was just a small argument about who put air into the car's tires because they just deflated. But after the minor argument, Arlis told Bruce she wanted to stop by Stanford's Memorial Church and pray. She wanted a moment to be alone, and she wanted a moment to just clear her head from this small argument about the car tires. Bruce wasn't going to fight with her, so he said goodbye to his wife and started walking back home. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Stephen Crawford was the night watch security guard on duty at the church that night. And he says that he saw Arlis walk into the church sometime around 11:50. The church was usually open for students for late night meditation, late night prayers, and this was something that Arlis did a lot. She turned to her faith for clarity and for peace. When Arlis walked in, there were two other worshipers there. They said they saw her come in, walk to the front pews, and kneel down to pray. And according to them, when they left around midnight, she was still deep in prayer. They didn't think much about it. At around 12:10 in the morning, Stephen Crawford, the security guard, called out into the church to see if anyone was still inside. The church normally closed at midnight, but he was running a few minutes behind. Now, although he later admitted that he didn't check every inch of the place, he said he called out a few more times to see if anyone was still inside, but no one responded. So sometime between 12:15 and 12:30, he locked up the church, thinking that Arlis had already left, just like the two other worshipers. It was around this same time that Bruce started to worry. She hadn't come home yet, so he decided to go to the church himself and see if she was still there. But when he got there, the front doors were locked. So he started walking around the rest of the Stanford campus. No sign of her. After not being able to find her, Bruce called the police to report her missing. But at this point, there wasn't much they could do. She had only been missing for a handful of hours. And when they went to the church themselves, it was all locked up. So the police just chalked it up to some type of domestic dispute, and they went on with their nights. It's now around 5:45 the following morning. Stephen Crawford, the same security guard who was on duty the night before, arrived at the church for his next shift. And according to him, as soon as he unlocked the front doors, that's when he saw Arlis. She was lying face up with her arms folded across her chest. She was in the same exact spot where the two witnesses had seen her the night before praying. She was naked from the waist down, and the jeans that she had been wearing the night before were draped across the lower half of her body. But the worst part, there was an ice pick sticking out of her left ear. She'd been stabbed in the head with an ice pick. It was obvious that Arlis's body had been staged. Her arms were folded neatly across her chest. It was an intentional staged scene, one that many people interpreted as ritualistic, possibly symbolic. On top of being bludgeoned to death by an ice pick, she'd also been sexually assaulted. And this wasn't just any ordinary assault. She'd been assaulted with one of the altar candles. The candle was found still inside of her body when the cops showed up. There was also a second candle found between her breasts. The crime scene inside the church shocked police. This wasn't just a killing, it looked like a message. But from who? And why Arlis? When it came to the forensic evidence, investigators knew she had suffered 3 distinct forms of trauma. Blunt force trauma to the head, likely the cause of death, manual strangulation, and sexual assault, with clear signs of post-mortem staging. Semen was recovered on the floor next to her body, and several fingerprints were found. A single fingerprint had been found on one of the candles used in the attack, as well as on the church's inner doors. The prints were immediately cross-checked against the databases, but no matches were found. Not a huge surprise considering this was 1974. The same could be said about the DNA. Even though they had recovered semen from the crime scene, there wasn't any type of DNA testing that could be done on it. So just like the fingerprints, the police didn't find any matches for the DNA either. Among those interviewed was Stephen Crawford, the campus security guard who claimed to have discovered Arlis's body. But he denied any involvement in what happened. But the police didn't just take his word for it. They needed to be sure he wasn't actually a suspect hiding in plain sight. So they asked for a DNA sample as well as a palm print so that they could be compared. But once again, this was the 1970s. Only a very basic DNA check was done, and ultimately, Stephen Crawford seemed to be eliminated. The same was said for Arlis Perry. He was also considered a suspect, but was ruled out fairly quickly. Neither the semen or the fingerprints matched. So even though he was the husband, the police ruled him out. The police knew that a total of 7 people were inside the church that night, 2 of them being Arlis and Stephen Crawford. Now, the police were able to identify 4 others, but the 7th person remained unknown. He was thought to be a young man who witnesses said they saw go inside the church sometime around midnight. They said he had sandy-colored hair, a medium build, and stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall. But unfortunately, the police were never able to identify this 7th person. There was a point during the investigation that detectives wondered if this case could be connected to others. They specifically looked at 3 previous murders that all happened in Santa Clara County, dating back to February of 1973. But 2 of those murders were eventually solved. The 3rd was never solved. As the case stretched into the 1980s and beyond, the forensic evidence collected in 1974 sat in storage, and Arlis's murder eventually turned cold. But there was one thing investigators couldn't stop wondering about. Could she have been murdered by a serial killer? During the 1970s, the Bay Area of Northern California became the stomping ground for serial killers and mass murders. There was Ed Kemper, who murdered at least 10 people, stalking young female hitchhikers. Then there was the Golden State Killer, the man eventually identified as Joseph James DeAngelo, a man responsible for murdering and sexually assaulting dozens of women. Next up, the Zodiac Killer, who murdered at least 5 people in the greater San Francisco area. Then finally, you can't forget about David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam. In a bizarre twist, David Berkowitz actually mentioned Arlis Perry in a few of his letters, suggesting that he had heard details about her murder from Mason 2, the alleged culprit. So for a while, people wondered if she could have been another one of the Son of Sam's victims. But eventually, that idea fizzled out. Still, when Arlis was murdered in 1974, investigators couldn't help but wonder if she could have been the victim of one of these NorCal serial killers. Maybe it was one they already knew about, or maybe there was someone else lurking in the shadows that the police had no idea about. There were also rumors tied to the satanic panic. From the moment her body was found, the crime scene sparked sensational theories. The way her body was posed, the placement of candles, her partially nude body, and the location within a church. This all led to rampant speculation that this was some kind of ritualistic killing. In the 1970s and 80s, America was entering what would later be known as a satanic panic, a wave of moral hysteria where stories of cults, ritual abuse, and satanic symbols made headlines all across the country. And if you looked at the facts of this case, it seemed to fit that narrative. Some believed she had stumbled into an occult ritual. Others thought she had been specifically targeted because of her outspoken Christian faith. One specific theory out there was that some Satan-like cult operating on or near Stanford's campus had been involved. There were even books written that cited her murder as supposed proof that these Satan groups were performing sacrifices everywhere, including at some of the top colleges in the entire world. But almost every one of these theories was based on speculation or fear, not on cold, hard evidence. There weren't any symbols carved into her body. There were no signs of the candles being used in any type of ceremonial pattern. And over the years, the police found no verified evidence linking this case to any cult activity. But still, the rumors were out there, and they were difficult for people to ignore, including investigators. Arlis's religious background only fueled the idea that this was some kind of twisted retaliation. Even years and decades later, her murder is still cited online as well as in documentaries about this time period. But putting the satanic panic and serial killers aside, the police were stuck with something far simpler. They had forensic evidence, but no match. And the one person who had been in the church that night, the one who also claimed to have discovered her body, had quietly faded into the background. It would take 44 years and a groundbreaking forensic approach to finally bring the real story to light. During that time, this case remained one of Northern California's most disturbing and mysterious unsolved murders. For years, dozens of leads came and went, but there was just something so puzzling about it. If Arlis wasn't killed by her husband, then who would have had motive? This was clearly a very brutal and personal attack. This looked like whoever did this was very, very angry at Arlis for some reason. But if it wasn't the person who was closest to her, her husband, then who were the police looking for? The unknown serial killer? Son of Sam? Did the Zodiac killer make a guest appearance on the Stanford campus? Was this actually connected to something related to the satanic panic? Back when the murder happened, all the forensic evidence, including the semen and fingerprints, were collected. But given the limitations of the time, not much was done with it. So it basically sat in the evidence locker at the sheriff's office, just waiting, until 2018. That year, the county's cold case unit reopened the case. This was a special unit involving both the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office as well as the Sheriff's Office. The first thing they wanted to do was retest the semen that had been recovered near Arlis's body. They knew that was going to be their best bet at finding her killer. Sure, the fingerprints were useful as well, but DNA is much better than prints. So the cold case unit took the semen, and using the latest DNA technology available, they were able to generate a full DNA profile from the sample. Then once they had the profile, they started the tedious process of forensic genetic genealogy, the process of taking unknown DNA and uploading it to genetic databases, looking for relatives of the unknown sample. The same type of technology talked about in a lot of these cases, and the same type of technology responsible for catching the Golden State Killer. Since then, hundreds and hundreds of cold cases all across the U.S. have been solved using this same type of advanced DNA testing. The results of both the DNA testing and the forensic genetic genealogy work pointed the police to a name that had been in the case file from the very beginning: Stephen Crawford, the Stanford campus security guard who reported finding her body back in 1974. It was an absolute stunning revelation for everyone, especially Santa Clara investigators. Crawford had always been considered just a witness, someone who stumbled upon a nightmare scene during a routine patrol. He was even cleared of any wrongdoing decades earlier because the police thought his DNA didn't match. But of course, they were using 1970 DNA testing methods that were nowhere near as accurate as they were in 2018. Now, decades later, science was telling a different story. Not only did his DNA match the semen recovered from Arlis, but his fingerprint matched the one that was lifted from the candle. Stephen Crawford wasn't just an innocent witness, he was a cold-blooded murderer. Armed with this new forensic evidence, investigators prepared to arrest Crawford at his home in San Jose. On June 28, 2018, they arrived with a search warrant. Even after all of these years, he still lived only about 20 miles away from Stanford. But before they could take him into custody, he did something completely unexpected. Once he saw that the cops were at his front door, he pulled out a gun and shot himself in the head. He died instantly. By this point, he was 72. For all the detectives who worked this case, his suicide was a final act of silence, and in many ways, a confirmation of guilt. Even though he was never formally charged, the forensic evidence was overwhelming. So immediately after Crawford's suicide, the authorities officially closed the case, declaring him responsible for the murder of Arlis Perry. With the 2018 forensic breakthrough, authorities finally closed the book on the murder of Arlis Perry, at least in the official capacity. DNA and fingerprint evidence definitively linked Stephen Crawford to the crime, and his suicide as police arrived to arrest him removed any doubt in the minds of investigators. But despite the forensic resolution, many unanswered questions remain. Why did he do it? Crawford never confessed, never left a note, and never offered any motive. He had worked on the Stanford campus for years, with access to the church and knowledge of its routines. But whether he acted on impulse or had planned the attack in advance is still unknown. Why the ritualistic staging? The position of Arlis's body, with the use of religious symbols and candles, was intentional. But what was the purpose? Was it meant to mislead investigators, or did it reflect something darker in Crawford's psyche? Without a confession or deeper psychological profile, those details remain unknown. Did he act alone? There's no concrete evidence to suggest anyone else was involved. But the strangeness of the crime scene has kept conspiracy theories alive for decades. Still, with no DNA or physical evidence pointing to a second person, police believe Crawford acted alone. Today, the Arlis Perry case stands as a reminder of both the limitations of early forensic science and the power of modern technology to bring justice, even after 40 years. It's also a case that demonstrates how easily rumor and fear can cloud a criminal investigation, overshadowing the hard science that ultimately solves it. Thanks to DNA testing and fingerprint analysis, Arlis's killer was finally identified. But the full story of that night inside of Stanford Memorial Church may have died with him. This case haunted investigators, her family, and the Stanford community for more than 4 decades. What happened to her inside that church was brutal, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. And for years, the lack of answers left space for fear, misinformation, and wild speculation. But in the end, it wasn't a psychic, occult confession, or a dramatic revelation that solved the case. It was forensic science. The DNA left behind by Stephen Crawford and the fingerprint he unknowingly left on the candle were the keys to the truth. It just took time and technology to finally catch up. Arlis's case is a powerful reminder that physical evidence doesn't disappear. It waits. And with the right tools, the right people, and the right moment, it can still speak, even decades later. If you want to support efforts to solve more cold cases just like this one, consider donating to organizations that fund forensic genetic genealogy as well as advanced DNA testing. I can proudly say that this podcast is a monthly financial donor to one of these organizations. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to hear my personal take on the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts on the case in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you never miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review. It helps the show grow. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in next week for a new case. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers. To Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at Courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.